They say eavesdropping never leads to anything good, but sometimes it leads to something necessary. I'm 72 years old, and I thought I knew my son. I thought I was safe in his home. Free. I thought the whispered conversations I'd been hearing through thin walls were about work stress or marriage troubles. I was wrong. Dead wrong. And when I heard my own son ask his wife why I was even still alive, I realized that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones planning your destruction. Before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps more people become aware of the reality of elder abuse. Now let me tell you what really happened. My name is Margaret Chen, but everyone calls me Maggie. 6 months ago, I buried my husband of 48 years and moved in with my son David and his family. At the time, it felt like a blessing. David insisted I shouldn't be alone in my grief, and his wife Jessica seemed genuinely welcoming. They had a beautiful 2-story home in the suburbs with a guest room that had its own bathroom, and my grandchildren, 16-year-old Sarah and 14-year-old Michael, said they were excited to have Grandma around more often. I should have known it was too good to be true. The first few months were pleasant enough. I helped with cooking, did some light cleaning, and watched the kids when David and Jessica had their date nights or business dinners. I tried to stay out of their way, spending most of my time in my room reading or in their backyard garden, which reminded me of the one Harold and I had tended together for decades. It was in that garden where my world fell apart. It was a Tuesday evening in early October. The air had that crisp quality that made me think of apple cider and Halloween decorations. I'd been inside most of the day, organizing some of Harold's old papers that I'd finally felt strong enough to go through. The kids were at their after-school activities, and I thought David and Jessica were still at work. I decided to step outside for some fresh air and to check on the tomatoes I'd been helping Jessica tend. The garden was at the back of their property, surrounded by a tall privacy fence. As I walked toward it, I could hear voices coming from the screened porch that overlooked the yard. At first, I was pleased. David and Jessica were home early, and maybe we could have dinner together as a family. But as I got closer, something in their tone made me slow my steps. "I can't do this much longer, David." Jessica's voice was strained, frustrated. "She's always here, always watching, always existing." I know. David's voice was tired, but there was something else in it. Something cold. I thought it would be temporary. A few months at most. I stopped walking. Something twisted in my stomach, but I told myself they couldn't be talking about me. Maybe they were discussing a difficult client or a problematic neighbor. "She's going to outlive us all," Jessica continued. "My grandmother lived to 97. What if she has those genes? We could be stuck with her for 25 more years." The world seemed to tilt. They were talking about me. "The worst part is how healthy she is," David said, and I heard the clink of a glass being set down. "She walks 3 miles every morning. She does yoga. She takes those vitamins religiously. Why is she even still alive when Dad's gone? He was the good one." I felt like I'd been slapped. Harold had been gone for 6 months, and our son was wishing I had died instead. "Maybe she'll have an accident," Jessica said quietly. "Old people fall all the time. Hip fractures can be deadly at her age." "Don't even joke about that," David said, but he didn't sound horrified. He sounded thoughtful. My legs were shaking. I reached out and steadied myself against a garden stake, trying to process what I was hearing. These were the people who had insisted I move in, who had told me I was family, who had made me believe I was wanted. "I'm not joking," Jessica continued. "I'm just saying accidents happen, and we'd inherit everything much sooner. Have you seen her bank statements? She's sitting on almost $800,000, plus the house in Connecticut is worth at least $450. We could pay off the mortgage, get the kids into private schools, maybe buy that cabin we've been talking about. She's not going to die anytime soon," David said. "We need another plan. What about that memory care facility we looked at for your father before he died? Willowbrook Manor. It's expensive. But if we can get a doctor to say she's showing signs of dementia, she's sharp as a tack. No doctor would believe it. Then we make her less sharp. There are medications that can cause confusion, memory problems. My friend Brenda works in pharmaceuticals. She could get us something." I pressed my hand to my mouth to keep from gasping out loud. They weren't just wishing I was dead. They were planning to drug me, to have me committed, to steal my money and my freedom. That's That's actually not a bad idea, David said slowly. If she starts showing symptoms of confusion, wandering, maybe some paranoid behavior, we'd have to take action for her own safety. Exactly. And once she's in the facility, we can get power of attorney. Handle her finances. Make sure she's comfortable for whatever time she has left. They were planning to destroy my mind and steal my life. My own son and the woman I'd welcomed as a daughter. How long do you think it would take? David asked. Brenda said the effects start showing up within a few weeks if you use the right dosage. Memory problems first, then disorientation, then paranoid behavior, classic signs of dementia, and no one would suspect anything. Who would? She's 72. It happens to lots of people her age. We'd just be the devoted family members doing our best to care for her. I stood there in the growing darkness, listening to them plan my mental destruction with the same casual tone they might use to discuss a vacation itinerary. Part of me wanted to march up to that porch and confront them, to scream and demand explanations, to call them the monsters they were. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the librarian in me, the part that had spent decades researching and gathering information before drawing conclusions. Maybe it was the voice of Harold, who had always told me to think before I acted. Or maybe it was just the survivor instinct that kicks in when you realize you're in more danger than you ever imagined. Instead of confronting them, I quietly backed away from the garden. I slipped around the side of the house and entered through the front door, making sure to announce my arrival. "I'm home," I called out cheerfully, as if I'd been out for a walk. "Hi, Mom," David called back from the porch. "How was your day?" "Wonderful," I replied, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Just wonderful." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning with everything I'd heard. I thought about packing my bags and leaving. I thought about calling the police. I thought about confronting David and Jessica with what I knew. But then I remembered something Harold used to say. The best defense is a good offense, but the best offense is one your enemy never sees coming. I'd been a librarian for 37 years. I knew how to research. I knew how to gather information. I knew how to be methodical and thorough. And most importantly, I knew how to be quiet about it. If David and Jessica wanted to play games with my life, they were about to learn that their 72-year-old victim was much smarter and far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. The war for my life had begun, and they didn't even know it yet. The next morning, I woke up before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt since Harold's death. For months, I'd been drifting through my grief like a ghost in my own life. But hearing my son plot against me had snapped something back into focus. I wasn't ready to be anyone's victim. I made my coffee in the quiet kitchen and sat at the table with a notepad, just like I used to do when I was working on research projects at the library. At the top of the page I wrote, "What I know and what I need to know." Under "What I know," I listed everything from the conversation I'd overheard. They wanted me gone. They wanted my money. They were planning to drug me to make me appear mentally incompetent. They had already researched memory care facilities and had a contact who could provide medication. Under "What I need to know," I wrote, "How long have they been planning this? Have they already started drugging me? What exactly is their timeline? Do they have access to my accounts already? What legal documents have they prepared?" By the time David came downstairs at 7:30, I was reading the morning paper and looked like any normal grandmother having her morning coffee. "You're up early, Mom," he said, kissing the top of my head with what I now recognized as practiced affection. "You know me?" I replied cheerfully. "Early bird catches the worm. Are you working late tonight?" "Actually, Jessica and I have a dinner meeting with some clients. We'll probably be out until 10 or 11. Will you be okay with the kids?" "Of course, sweetheart. You know I love spending time with Sarah and Michael." He smiled, but I caught something calculating in his expression. Were they meeting with someone about their plan? A lawyer? A doctor? I filed the information away. After David and Jessica left for work, I began my investigation in earnest. The first thing I did was check my medications. I kept my vitamins and prescriptions in a small basket on my dresser. Everything looked normal, but I made a mental note to pay attention to any unusual drowsiness or confusion in the coming days. Next, I went through my important papers. My will was locked in my file cabinet, unchanged since Harold's death. It left everything to David, with provisions for the grandchildren's education. Seeing that document now made my stomach turn. I was literally financing my own destruction. I spent the morning going through the house methodically, looking for anything that might give me insight into their plans. In David's home office, I found financial documents that made my blood run cold. Bank statements showing transfers from my accounts to theirs. Small amounts, nothing I would have noticed, but adding up to nearly $15,000 over the past 4 months. They'd been stealing from me while I grieved my husband. I photographed the statements with my phone, something I'd learned to do when my teenage granddaughter had showed me last Christmas. Technology wasn't as foreign to me as people assumed. I'd been dealing with computer systems at the library for 15 years before I retired. In Jessica's desk drawer, I found a folder labeled Eldercare Research. Inside were brochures for 3 different memory care facilities, including Willowbrook Manor. There were notes in Jessica's handwriting about costs, admission requirements, and most chilling, about how to get someone committed against their will. One note read, "Power of attorney, need medical documentation of incapacity. Dr. Morrison might be sympathetic, check with Brenda about timeline for symptoms." Dr. Morrison. That was my own doctor, the one David had insisted I switch to when I moved in with them. The one who had seemed unusually interested in my mental state during my last checkup, asking detailed questions about my memory and mood that had seemed excessive at the time. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was terrifying. That afternoon, while the house was still empty, I made a phone call I should have made months ago. I called my old friend Emma Rodriguez, who had been one of my favorite students when I was still working. Emma was now 28 and worked in digital security for a tech company in Hartford. More importantly, she was someone I trusted completely. "Mrs. Chen?" Emma's voice was bright with genuine pleasure. "How are you holding up? I've been thinking about you since Mr. Chen's funeral." Well, that's actually why I'm calling, Emma. I need some help, and I think you might be the only person who can provide it." There was a pause. Emma had always been perceptive. Even as a teenager. "What kind of help?" I took a deep breath. "The kind that might keep me out of a nursing home I don't belong in." "I'll be right over." "No, not here. Can we meet somewhere private? Maybe that coffee shop near the library where we used to meet for your research projects. Cafe Luna. I'll be there in an hour." "Mrs. Chen? Are you in some kind of trouble?" "The worst kind," I said quietly. "The kind that comes from your own family." 2 hours later, I sat across from Emma in a corner booth at Cafe Luna, watching her face grow increasingly grim as I told her everything. I showed her the photographs I'd taken, shared every detail of the conversation I'd overheard, and explained about the mysterious transfers from my bank accounts. Emma listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on her phone. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Chen," she finally said, "this isn't just elder abuse. This is conspiracy, fraud, and potentially attempted murder. Have you considered going to the police?" "With what proof?" "Everything I have is circumstantial. They'd say I was a grieving widow with an overactive imagination. David's respected in the community. He's on the hospital board. People would believe him over me?" Emma nodded slowly. "You're right, we need more evidence. And we need to protect you while we gather it." She leaned forward. "I have some ideas. But first I need to ask you something important. How far are you willing to go to stop them?" I thought about Harold, about the life we'd built together, about the grandchildren I adored and the future I'd imagined. Then I thought about David asking why I was still alive and Jessica discussing my potential accidents. "As far as it takes," I said firmly. "I didn't survive 72 years to let my own son destroy me now." Emma smiled. And I saw something fierce and protective in her expression that reminded me why she'd always been one of my favorite students. She'd grown up to be exactly the strong, brilliant woman I'd always known she could become. "Then here's what we're going to do," she said, pulling out her laptop. "We're going to turn you into a ghost in their own house. We're going to gather evidence they never knew existed. And we're going to make sure that when this is over, they're the ones who've lost everything." For the first time since Harold's death, I felt hope stirring in my chest. I wasn't alone in this fight. I had an ally, and together, we were going to make sure justice was served. The investigation was about to begin in earnest, and David and Jessica had no idea what was coming for them. Emma returned to David's house with me that evening, introduced as my former student who was helping me digitize some of Harold's old papers. It was the perfect cover story, believable and innocent enough that David and Jessica welcomed her warmly. "It's so nice that you're helping Mom with this project," Jessica said, playing the part of the caring daughter-in-law perfectly. She's been so lost since Harold died. Having a project will be good for her. I smiled and nodded, playing my part too. The grieving, helpless widow who needed guidance and support. If only they knew that their helpless victim was about to turn their own house into a surveillance operation. Once we were alone in my room, Emma got to work with an efficiency that reminded me why she'd been such an exceptional student. From her bag, she pulled out devices I didn't recognize, but trusted her to use properly. First, she said, keeping her voice low, we need to protect you from whatever they might try to slip you. I'm going to set up a small camera in your room, positioned to record your medication area. If they tamper with anything, we'll have evidence. The camera was tiny, no bigger than a button, and she attached it to a picture frame in such a way that it was completely invisible. She showed me how to access the feed on my phone through an app that looked like a simple photo gallery. Next, she continued, we need to document everything they're doing. I'm going to install some monitoring software on the family computer. Nothing illegal, just programs that will track their internet searches, document any financial transactions, and record any communications related to you. Can you do that without them knowing? Emma grinned. Mrs. Chen, you taught me to be thorough in my research. I've just applied those skills to a different field. David uses the same password for everything, Sarah's birthday plus his high school graduation year. People are predictable. While she worked on the computer, I kept watch by the window. David and Jessica were still at their client dinner, and the kids were in their rooms doing homework. We had maybe an hour before anyone would come looking for us. There, Emma said, closing the laptop. I've also set up a backup system that will automatically send copies of everything to a secure server I maintain. Even if they destroy their computer, we'll have records. She handed me a small device that looked like a hearing aid. This is a recording device. It's voice activated and has a range of about 20 feet. If they have another conversation like the one you overheard, we'll have it documented. Emma, I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Chen. You believed in me when no one else did. You helped me get into college, you wrote recommendation letters, you even lent me money for textbooks when my family couldn't afford them. This is me returning the favor. The next few days fell into a routine that felt surreal. During the day, I played the role of the aging mother and grandmother, helpful but increasingly frail. I made sure to mention small memory lapses, forgetting where I put my reading glasses, losing track of what day it was. Nothing dramatic, just enough to support their narrative if they were already laying groundwork with others. But at night, Emma and I would review the digital evidence that was accumulating at an alarming rate. The monitoring software revealed searches that made my skin crawl. David had been researching signs of dementia in elderly parents and how to get power of attorney for incompetent relative. Jessica had been looking up medications that cause confusion and average lifespan in memory care facilities. Even more disturbing were the emails we uncovered. David had been corresponding with Dr. Morrison about concerning mental symptoms, describing incidents that had never happened. According to his messages, I had gotten lost in my own neighborhood, forgotten to turn off the stove multiple times, and had accused the mail carrier of stealing my letters. None of it was true, but Morrison's responses showed he was taking David's concerns seriously and was already preparing documentation for a competency evaluation. The financial evidence was even more damning. The monitoring software showed they had been accessing my bank accounts regularly, making small withdrawals they disguised as grocery money or gas for errands. But the pattern was clear. They were systematically draining my savings while building a paper trail that would support their claim that I was no longer capable of managing my finances. 3 days after Emma installed the surveillance system, we hit the jackpot. I was in the garden again, pretending to water the plants, while actually using the recording device Emma had given me. David and Jessica were on the porch, and their conversation made my blood run cold. Brenda came through, Jessica said. She got the medication. It's a low-dose version of something they use for Alzheimer's research. In the right amount, it causes confusion and short-term memory loss. In a higher dose, it can cause hallucinations and paranoid behavior. How do we give it to her without her noticing? It's tasteless and dissolves completely. We can put it in her morning coffee. She drinks the same cup every day, that blue ceramic one Harold gave her for their anniversary. We just have to make sure we're the ones making her coffee. When do we start? Tomorrow. Brenda says the effects should be noticeable within a week. By the time we have the appointment with Dr. Morrison next month, she should be showing clear signs of cognitive decline. And if she gets suspicious, who's going to believe her? She's a grieving widow who's already starting to show signs of dementia. If she starts making wild accusations against her devoted son and daughter-in-law, that'll just be more evidence that she's losing her grip on reality. They laughed, actually laughed, at the thought of my mental breakdown. I had to press my hand against my mouth to keep from screaming. But I had them now. The recording was clear, detailed, and completely incriminating. Emma had been right. They'd gotten so comfortable in their scheme that they'd stopped being careful. That night, Emma and I reviewed the recording and the latest batch of digital evidence. We now had proof of conspiracy, elder abuse, financial theft, and attempted poisoning. It was more than enough to destroy them legally, but Emma had a different suggestion. "We could go to the police now," she said, "but I think we should wait." "Wait? Emma, they're going to start drugging me tomorrow?" "No, they're not." She smiled grimly. "Because tonight, we're going to replace their medication with something harmless. Crushed vitamins that dissolve the same way. Let them think they're drugging you while we gather even more evidence." "But what's the point of waiting?" "Because right now, we can prove they plan to do these things. But if we wait, we can prove they actually did them. The difference between attempted crimes and completed crimes could mean years in prison versus a slap on the wrist." Emma was right, of course. She usually was. That night, while the house slept, she crept into David and Jessica's room and switched out the medication in Jessica's purse. The next morning, I drank my coffee as usual, knowing that instead of mind-altering drugs, I was getting a harmless dose of vitamin B complex. For the next week, I played my part perfectly. I pretended to be increasingly confused and forgetful. I lost my keys several times. I asked David to repeat things he'd never said. I seemed disoriented about dates and times. David and Jessica were delighted with my rapid decline. They made sure to document every incident, taking notes and even recording some of my confused moments on their phones. They had no idea they were creating evidence of their own crime. Meanwhile, Emma and I were documenting everything from our end. We had recordings of them discussing my condition, copies of the fake medical reports David was sending to Dr. Morrison, and financial records showing they had increased their theft as my supposed mental state deteriorated. By the end of that week, we had enough evidence to destroy them 10 times over. But Emma was right, we weren't done yet. We were going to let them dig their hole so deep that there would be no chance of escape. The appointment with Dr. Morrison was scheduled for the following Monday. David and Jessica were planning to have me declared incompetent and begin the process of having me committed to Willowbrook Manor. They had no idea that instead of achieving their goal, they were walking into a trap that would cost them everything. The pieces were all in place. The evidence was overwhelming, and I was no longer the helpless victim they thought they were destroying. I was their judge, jury, and executioner, and they were about to learn that underestimating a 72-year-old librarian was the biggest mistake of their lives. The morning of my appointment with Dr. Morrison, I sat in the passenger seat of David's car, playing the role of a confused elderly woman while my mind was sharp as a razor. Emma had spent the weekend helping me prepare for what was about to happen, and every detail of our plan was carefully orchestrated. "Now remember, Mom," David said as we pulled into the medical building parking lot, dark. "Morrison just wants to check on how you've been feeling lately. He's concerned about some of the symptoms Jessica and I have noticed." "What symptoms?" I asked, letting a note of genuine confusion creep into my voice. It wasn't hard. I was confused about how my own son had become such a monster. "The forgetfulness, Mom. Getting lost in the neighborhood. Leaving the stove on. You've been having more and more episodes lately." None of which had actually happened, but I nodded slowly as if trying to remember things that existed only in his lies. Dr. Morrison's office was exactly what I'd expected, sterile, impersonal, designed to make elderly patients feel diminished. The man himself was younger than David, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of patronizing smile that medical professionals sometimes develop when dealing with older patients. "Mrs. Chen," he said warmly, "how are we feeling today?" "We," as if I were a child who couldn't speak for myself. "I'm fine," I said, then added with practiced hesitation, "I think I'm fine. Sometimes I'm not sure." Morrison exchanged a meaningful look with David, who was sitting beside me taking notes on his phone, ostensibly to help me remember what the doctor said, but actually to document my supposed confusion for his records. Your son has expressed some concerns about your memory and general cognitive function, Dr. Morrison said gently. Can you tell me what day of the week it is? Tuesday? I said confidently, then frowned. No, wait. Is it Wednesday? I'm sorry, the days all seem to run together now. It was Monday. That's quite all right. Can you tell me who the current president is? I gave him the name of the president from 8 years ago, then corrected myself with the current one, then looked uncertain. I'm sorry, there have been so many changes. It's hard to keep track. Dr. Morrison made notes while asking me a series of questions designed to test cognitive function. I answered some correctly, some incorrectly, and some with the kind of confused responses that suggested early-stage dementia. It was a carefully calibrated performance, designed to support their narrative while not making me appear completely incompetent. After about 20 minutes of this charade, Dr. Morrison asked David to step outside with him. I sat alone in the examination room, knowing that Emma was monitoring everything through the recording device I wore, which would pick up their conversation in the hallway. When they returned, both men looked satisfied in a way that made my skin crawl. Mrs. Chen, Dr. Morrison said, I think it would be beneficial for you to have some additional testing. There are facilities that specialize in cognitive assessment for people in your situation. What kind of situation? I asked, letting fear creep into my voice. Nothing to worry about, David said quickly, patting my hand. Just some routine tests to make sure we're taking the best possible care of you. Dr. Morrison handed David some paperwork. I've prepared the initial evaluation forms. Based on what I've observed today and the incidents David has documented, I believe we have sufficient grounds to begin the competency assessment process. My heart was racing, but I kept my expression confused and compliant. They thought they were winning. They had no idea they'd just given me everything I needed to destroy them. The drive home was quiet. David was pleased, probably mentally calculating how soon he could get his hands on my money. I stared out the window, letting him think his confused mother was simply overwhelmed by the doctor's appointment. But when we arrived home, Emma's car was in the driveway. What's she doing here? David asked, his voice tight with annoyance. I asked her to help me organize more of Harold's papers. I said, I hope that's all right. Sometimes I get confused about what I've already done. David's expression softened at my reference to confusion. He was probably thrilled that the medication was working so well. Of course, Mom. Take all the time you need. Emma met us at the door, playing her role perfectly. Hello, Mr. Chen. How did the doctor's appointment go? Very well, David said. De gras. Morrison is going to help us make sure Mom gets the best possible care. Once we were alone in my room, Emma's demeanor changed completely. How did it go? She asked quietly. Exactly as we planned. I have everything we need. I activated the playback on the recording device, and we listened to Dr. Morrison and David's hallway conversation. The cognitive decline is progressing faster than I expected. Dr. Morrison's voice came through clearly. Based on your documentation and my examination, I can justify recommending immediate placement in a supervised care facility. How soon? David's voice. I can have the paperwork ready by the end of the week. Once we have the competency ruling, you'll be able to assume full power of attorney. The transition should be seamless. And there won't be any questions about the rapid progression. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon. Sometimes a major life change like losing a spouse can accelerate cognitive decline dramatically. Combined with the incidents you've documented, it presents a clear picture of someone who can no longer safely live independently. Emma and I looked at each other. We had them discussing the fraudulent competency assessment, the rushed timeline, and Dr. Morrison's willingness to manipulate the system based on David's false documentation. It's time, Emma said. We have everything we need. How do you want to do this? I had been thinking about this moment for weeks. I wanted justice, but I also wanted it to be devastating and complete. David and Jessica had planned to steal my life systematically and carefully. I was going to return the favor. I want to give them exactly what they think they're getting, I said. Let them proceed with their plan, let them think they've won, and then, when they're completely committed and there's no way back, we spring the trap. Emma smiled grimly. The legal papers are already prepared. I've been working with a lawyer friend who specializes in elder abuse cases. The moment you give the word, we can have David and Jessica arrested on multiple felony charges. We also have everything we need to have Dr. Morrison's medical license suspended and bring criminal charges against him. What about the money they've stolen? Full restitution plus punitive damages. The financial evidence is ironclad. They'll be bankrupted by the legal fees alone, and that's before they face the civil lawsuit. And the grandchildren. Emma's expression softened. Sarah and Michael will be protected. They're old enough to understand what their parents did, and they'll have choices about where they want to live. From what you've told me about them, I think they'll make the right decision. I nodded. In all of this planning for justice, the hardest part had been thinking about how this would affect Sarah and Michael. But they deserved to know the truth about their parents, and they deserved to be protected from the same kind of betrayal I'd suffered. There's one more thing, I said. I want them to confess. I want them to admit what they've done, on record, believing they've gotten away with it. How do we make that happen? I smiled, and for the first time in months, it felt genuine. By giving them a victory celebration they'll never forget. That evening, I played my part at dinner, seeming more confused and disoriented than ever. I forgot Sarah's name for a moment, looked lost when Michael mentioned school, and asked David 3 times what day it was. David and Jessica exchanged pleased glances. Their plan was working perfectly, or so they believed. They had no idea that their confused, helpless victim was actually the architect of their complete destruction. Dr. Morrison would file his competency report within days. The legal proceedings would begin, and David and Jessica would finally have everything they thought they wanted. They just didn't realize that getting everything you want sometimes turns out to be the worst thing that can happen to you. The trap was set, and they were walking into it with smiles on their faces. 3 days later, David came home from work with the biggest smile I'd seen on his face since Harold's funeral. He was practically bouncing on his feet as he kissed my cheek and asked how I was feeling. A little tired, I said, playing my part. I couldn't remember where I put my medication this morning. Jessica had to help me find it. That's okay, Mom. You don't need to worry about things like that much longer. The way he said it sent chills down my spine, but I just nodded and smiled vaguely. That evening, after the kids had gone to bed, David opened a bottle of expensive wine, something I recognized as a vintage Harold, and I had been saving for a special occasion. Apparently, my mental destruction qualified as a celebration in David's mind. What's the occasion? I asked, accepting the glass Jessica handed me. We have some good news, David said, settling into his chair with the satisfied look of a man whose plans were coming together. Dr. Morrison called today. He's completed his evaluation, and he thinks it would be best for you to move into a specialized care facility. I let my face fall, the way any normal person would react to such news. A nursing home. But I don't want to leave. This is my home now? It's not a nursing home, Mom, Jessica said gently, though I caught the gleam of victory in her eyes. It's more like an assisted living community. You'll have your own apartment, but there will be people there to help you with daily tasks when you get confused. But I like it here. I like being with my grandchildren. You'll still see us all the time, David said. And honestly, Mom, it's for your own safety. What if you forgot to turn off the stove and started a fire? What if you got lost walking in the neighborhood? We love you too much to let something terrible happen. The concern in his voice was so perfectly acted that if I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed he actually cared about my welfare. I asked quietly. Well, there's a spot available at Willowbrook Manor next week, Jessica said. It's a beautiful place, Mom. We toured it yesterday, and it's perfect for someone in your situation. We thought we'd move you in on Saturday, David added. Give you the weekend to settle in before they start your treatment program. Treatment program. The phrase made my stomach turn, but I nodded as if I understood. I suppose, I said slowly, if you think it's best. We do, David said firmly. And there's something else we need to discuss. The doctors think it would be easier on you if Jessica and I handled your finances for a while. Just until your condition stabilizes. There it was. The whole purpose of this elaborate charade, my finances? Just the day-to-day stuff, Jessica said smoothly. Paying bills, managing investments, that sort of thing. You don't need to worry about any of it. Harold always handled the money, I said, which was completely untrue. I'd managed our finances for 48 years while he focused on his engineering work, but it was what they expected to hear. Exactly, David said, And now we'll handle it for you. They spent the next hour explaining how they were taking over my entire life, presenting it as a gift they were giving me rather than the theft it actually was. I played the confused, grateful mother, thanking them for their sacrifice and wondering aloud what I'd do without such devoted family. When I finally went to bed that night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about how completely they believed they had won. In their minds, I was already gone. The sharp, independent woman who had raised David, who had worked for nearly 4 decades, who had built a life with Harold, she was already dead. What was left was just a confused old woman they could manipulate and control until her body finally caught up with her supposedly failing mind. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They had underestimated their victim. The next morning I called Emma with a simple message. "It's time. Are you sure?" she asked. "Once we do this, there's no going back. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Then let's destroy them." That afternoon, while David and Jessica were at work and the kids were at school, Emma arrived with 2 other people, Detective Sarah Martinez from the Elder Abuse Unit and Catherine Wells, an attorney who specialized in financial crimes against seniors. "Mrs. Chen," Detective Martinez said after Emma had made the introductions, "I need to ask you some questions about your living situation and recent experiences with your son and daughter-in-law." For the next 2 hours, I told my story from the beginning. I shared every piece of evidence Emma and I had gathered, played every recording, and showed them every document that proved David and Jessica's conspiracy. Detective Martinez took detailed notes while Attorney Wells reviewed the financial evidence with an expression that grew increasingly grim. "This is one of the most comprehensive elder abuse cases I've ever seen," Detective Martinez said finally. "The financial theft alone is a Class B felony. Add in the conspiracy, the medication plot, and the medical fraud, and we're looking at potential sentences of 20 to 30 years. "What about Dr. Morrison?" I asked. "Medical board investigation and criminal charges," Attorney Wells said. "His medical license will be suspended immediately, and he'll likely face jail time for fraud and conspiracy." "And my grandchildren?" Detective Martinez's expression softened. "They'll be interviewed. But based on what you've told us, they had no knowledge of their parents' activities. Child Services will evaluate the situation, but since they're teenagers, they'll have input on their living arrangements." "What happens next?" Emma asked. "We execute the arrest warrants tomorrow evening," Detective Martinez said. "Mrs. Chen, I need you to continue acting normally until then. Don't give them any indication that anything has changed. Tomorrow evening, David and Jessica have planned a celebration dinner," Attorney Wells said, consulting her notes. "According to the evidence you provided, they've made reservations at Romano's restaurant to toast their successful manipulation of your doctor's appointment. We'll arrest them there, in front of the other diners. Sometimes public humiliation is part of justice." I thought about that for a moment. David and Jessica, dressed in their best clothes, raising champagne glasses to celebrate stealing my life and my freedom. The looks on their faces when the handcuffs appeared, the whispers from other diners as they were led away. "Perfect," I said. "The next 24 hours were the longest of my life." I played my part perfectly, seeming confused and compliant as David and Jessica made their final preparations for my imprisonment. Jessica had already started packing some of my belongings, carefully selecting items that would support the narrative of a woman who could no longer care for herself. "I'm so proud of how you're handling this, Mom," David said that morning as he adjusted his tie in preparation for work. "I know the transition is scary, but you're being very brave." Brave. If only he knew. That evening, as they prepared to leave for their celebration dinner, David kissed my forehead and told me that everything was going to be wonderful. Jessica hugged me and said that by this time next week, all my worries would be over. They were right about that, just not in the way they imagined. I watched from the living room window as they drove away, dressed in their finest clothes, heading to what they thought was a victory celebration. In reality, they were driving to the complete destruction of their lives. An hour later, my phone rang. "It's done," Detective Martinez said. "David and Jessica Chen are in custody. Dr. Morrison was arrested at his office 30 minutes ago. The charges have been filed, and the investigation is officially open." I sank into Harold's old chair and closed my eyes. It was over. But more than that, it was just the beginning. For months, David and Jessica had planned my erasure, my disappearance from my own life. They had counted on my confusion, my helplessness, my inability to fight back. Instead, I had erased them from everything that mattered. Their freedom, their reputation, their financial security, their professional lives, gone. Just as they had planned to do to me. The only difference was that I had done it legally, justly, and completely. Harold always said that the best revenge was living well. But sometimes, I thought as I poured myself a glass of his good wine. The best revenge was making sure the people who tried to destroy you faced the full consequences of their actions. David and Jessica were about to learn that lesson in the hardest way possible. The house felt different the morning after David and Jessica's arrest. For the first time in months, I woke up without having to pretend to be someone I wasn't. I made my coffee in Harold's favorite mug, not the blue ceramic one Jessica had planned to use for drugging me, and sat at the kitchen table, reading the morning paper like a normal person, instead of a woman fighting for her life. The doorbell rang at 9 o'clock. Through the window, I could see Sarah and Michael standing on the porch, still in their school clothes from the day before. My heart broke a little, knowing that their world had completely changed overnight. "Grandma," Sarah said when I opened the door. Her eyes were red from crying, and Michael stood behind her looking lost and confused. "Come in, sweetheart," I said, pulling them both into a hug. "We need to talk." We sat in the living room, the same room where I'd overheard their parents planning my destruction. But now it felt safe again, a place where truth could be spoken instead of lies whispered in shadows. "The social worker told us what Mom and Dad did," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "They said you're not really sick, that Mom and Dad were trying to steal your money." "That's right," I said gently. "I know this is hard to understand. But why?" Michael asked. "Why would they do that to you?" It was the question I'd been dreading, because how do you explain to children that their parents are capable of such cruelty? How do you help them understand without destroying their ability to trust anyone again? "Sometimes people make very bad choices," I said carefully. "Your parents convinced themselves that what they were doing was acceptable, because they thought they would get your inheritance eventually anyway. They didn't think about how wrong it was, or how much it would hurt me, or how it would affect you." "We didn't know?" Sarah said quickly. "I swear, Grandma, we had no idea what they were planning." "Of course you didn't. And I never thought you did. You're good kids, both of you. This isn't your fault, and it doesn't change how much I love you." Michael was quiet for a long moment, then asked, "What's going to happen to us?" "That depends on what you want," I said. "You're both old enough to have a say in where you live. You could go to your other grandparents, or to your Aunt Susan in California, or—" I paused, not wanting to pressure them but hoping they'd understand the option I was offering. "Or," Sarah prompted, "or you could stay here with me. I know I'm not your parent, and I know this house probably feels strange now. But if you want to stay, we can make it work." The relief on both their faces was immediate and profound. "Yes," Sarah said quickly. "Yes, we want to stay with you. Are you sure? It won't be easy. There's going to be a trial, and people will ask you questions about your parents. The media might get involved. Your friends at school will have questions." "We're sure," Michael said, speaking up for the first time since they'd arrived. "You're the only family we have left that we can trust." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and difficult conversations. The story of the elderly woman who'd outsmarted her own son's elaborate abuse scheme made headlines across the state. Reporters called it everything from "the grandmother's revenge" to "digital age elder abuse exposed." Emma became something of a local hero, praised for her technical expertise and loyalty to her former teacher. She gave several interviews about how to protect elderly relatives from financial abuse, and was even invited to speak at a conference on digital security for seniors. Dr. Morrison's medical license was suspended pending investigation. The medical board found evidence of at least 3 other cases where he'd been suspiciously quick to declare elderly patients incompetent at the request of their adult children. His career was over, and he was facing criminal charges in multiple cases. David and Jessica's legal situation was catastrophic. The evidence Emma and I had gathered was so comprehensive that their lawyers advised them to plead guilty rather than face trial. David was sentenced to 12 years in prison for elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy. Jessica received 10 years for her role in the scheme. The financial restitution was complete. Every penny they'd stolen was returned with interest, plus punitive damages that left them bankrupt. Their house was sold to pay legal fees, and their assets were frozen pending the civil lawsuit I filed against them. But the most satisfying moment came during the sentencing hearing, when the judge allowed me to make a victim impact statement. I stood at the podium in that courtroom, looking directly at David and Jessica for the first time since their arrest, and spoke the words I'd been practicing for weeks. "Your Honor," I began, "the defendants tried to convince the world that I was a confused, helpless elderly woman who could no longer think for herself. They tried to steal not just my money, but my dignity, my independence, and my future. They planned to drug me, imprison me, and watch me die while they spent the money my husband and I saved over 48 years of marriage. David wouldn't meet my eyes, but Jessica was staring at me with a mixture of hatred and disbelief, as if she still couldn't quite understand how their perfect plan had fallen apart. But they made one crucial mistake, I continued. They underestimated their victim. I may be 72 years old, but my mind is sharp, my resolve is strong, and my sense of justice is absolute. They tried to erase me from my own life, so I erased them from theirs. The only difference is that I did it legally, ethically, and completely. I paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the courtroom. I hope that during their time in prison, they have the opportunity to reflect on what they've done and find some genuine remorse. Not because I forgive them, I don't, but because their children deserve better than parents who are capable of such cruelty. When I sat down, the courtroom was completely silent. Even the judge seemed moved by what I'd said. That evening, Sarah, Michael, and I had dinner at the kitchen table where so much of this story had unfolded. We talked about school, about their friends, about the college applications Sarah would be working on next year. Normal family conversations that felt precious after everything we'd been through. "Grandma," Michael said as we were cleaning up, "I'm proud of you. What you did, it was amazing. You saved yourself and you saved us too." "We saved each other," I corrected. "Families protect each other. Real families, anyway." Later that night, I sat in Harold's chair with a cup of tea, looking through photo albums from happier times. Pictures of David as a child, birthday parties and Christmas mornings, family vacations where everyone was smiling and the future looked bright and certain. I mourned for that little boy in the photographs, the son I'd raised who had somehow grown into a man capable of such betrayal. But I didn't regret what I'd done. I couldn't regret protecting myself and my grandchildren from people who would have destroyed us all for money. Emma stopped by the next morning, as she had every day since the arrests. "How are you doing?" she asked, settling into the chair across from me. "Better?" I said honestly. "Different, but better. I feel like myself again for the first time since Harold died." "What's next?" I smiled, thinking about the plans I'd been making. Sarah and Michael need stability while they finish school. After that, who knows? I might travel. I might volunteer. I might write a book about all this. "You should," Emma said. "Other people need to hear this story. Other elderly people who might be in similar situations. Other families who need to know the warning signs. Maybe I will." I looked around the house that had been both a prison and a battlefield, and was now simply home again. I have time to figure it out. For the first time in months, I have all the time in the world. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since before Harold died. I worked in the garden, really worked, planting new flowers and pulling weeds and planning what I wanted to grow in the spring. As I dug in the soil, I thought about renewal and growth and second chances. I thought about how sometimes the worst things that happen to us can lead to discoveries about our own strength that we never knew we possessed. David and Jessica had tried to bury me alive, metaphorically speaking. Instead, they had planted the seeds of their own destruction and given me the motivation to bloom stronger than ever. The garden would be beautiful next spring. So would my life. 6 months after David and Jessica's sentencing, I stood in front of a room full of seniors at the Riverside Community Center, sharing my story for the first time publicly. Emma sat in the front row, beaming with pride, while Sarah and Michael watched from chairs near the back, having insisted on coming to support me. "The reason I'm telling you this story," I said to the assembled audience of gray-haired men and women, some using walkers, some sharp as tacks, all of them listening with the intensity of people who understood they might face similar situations, "is not for sympathy. It's to show you that being older doesn't mean being powerless. It doesn't mean accepting abuse or manipulation, even from our own families." An elderly man in the third row raised his hand. "But what if we don't have someone like your Emma? What if we don't know about computers and recording devices and all that technical stuff?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asked at every presentation I'd given over the past few months. "You don't need to be a tech expert," I said. "You need to trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Document everything you can, keep journals, save paperwork. Tell trusted friends what's happening. Most importantly, don't suffer in silence. There are resources available, people trained to help. organizations that specialize in protecting seniors from abuse. I had learned about many of these resources in the months since the trial. Detective Martinez had introduced me to social workers, victim advocates, and other professionals who made it their mission to protect elderly people from the kind of abuse I'd suffered. Some of them had become good friends. After my presentation, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "My daughter has been pressuring me to sign over power of attorney," she said quietly. "She says it's for my own good, but something about it feels wrong. She's been talking about how expensive my house is to maintain, how I don't really need all that space." I spent 20 minutes with her, sharing resources and contact information, helping her understand that her instincts were probably right and that she had options. By the time our conversation ended, she was standing straighter, looking more confident. This had become my new purpose, helping other seniors recognize abuse and giving them the tools to fight back or seek help. Emma had helped me create a website with resources, warning signs, and contact information for agencies that could assist. We'd received hundreds of messages from people sharing their own stories or asking for advice. "You've become quite the activist," Emma said as we drove home from the community center. "I never intended to," I admitted. "I just wanted to survive David and Jessica's scheme. But once I realized how common this type of abuse is, how many elderly people are being taken advantage of by their own families, I felt like I had to do something." "Harold would be proud," Emma said softly. She was right. Harold had always believed in standing up for what was right, in using whatever talents you had to help others. He would have loved knowing that his death, as painful as it had been, had ultimately led to something meaningful. That evening, Sarah showed me her acceptance letter to Columbia University. She'd been accepted into their pre-law program with a substantial scholarship. "I want to specialize in elder law," she told me. "I want to help people like you, Grandma. I want to make sure what Mom and Dad did to you doesn't happen to other families." Michael, now a junior in high school, had been accepted into a summer program for students interested in digital forensics. "Emma's been teaching me about cybersecurity," he said. "I think I want to study computer science in college. Maybe work on protecting people from online fraud." Both of my grandchildren had taken the trauma of their parents' betrayal and transformed it into motivation to help others. I was incredibly proud of them, and grateful that something positive had emerged from such a dark experience. The house we shared was nothing like the tense environment it had been when David and Jessica lived here. We had family dinners where everyone actually talked to each other. We watched movies together on weekends. Sarah and Michael brought friends over, and the house was filled with the sound of teenage laughter again. I had also made peace with my new reality in ways I hadn't expected. The loneliness that had consumed me after Harold's death had been replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. One year after that terrible evening when I'd overheard David and Jessica planning my destruction, Emma and I sat in the same garden where it all began. The tomatoes I'd planted were heavy on the vine, and the flower beds were bursting with color. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked. "Fighting back the way you did? The media attention, the trial, having to relive everything." I thought about her question carefully. David was my son. Despite everything he'd done, there was a part of me that still mourned the relationship we'd lost, the family we might have been. "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "I regret that David and Jessica chose the path they did. I regret that Sarah and Michael had to learn such painful truths about their parents. But fighting back, protecting myself and exposing what they were doing? No, I don't regret that for a second. What they tried to do to you was evil," Emma said firmly. "Calling it anything else would be dishonest." "Yes, it was. And evil should have consequences." That's what I learned through all of this. That being older doesn't mean accepting whatever treatment people decide to give you. It doesn't mean becoming invisible or powerless. We have the right to dignity, to safety, to control over our own lives, regardless of our age. As the sun set over the garden, I thought about the dozens of people who had reached out to me since my story became public. Some were seniors who recognized warning signs in their own families. Others were adult children who realized they needed to examine their own motivations and behaviors toward their aging parents. A few were professionals, doctors, lawyers, social workers, who said my case had opened their eyes to forms of elder abuse they hadn't been watching for closely enough. "You've started something bigger than just your own case," Emma observed. There's legislation being proposed in 3 states now that would strengthen protections for seniors and increase penalties for family members who commit financial abuse. The Margaret Chen Act, I said with a slight smile. I never imagined having a law named after me. Harold would have gotten a kick out of that, Emma said. That night I sat in Harold's chair with a cup of tea and a book, surrounded by the comfortable silence of a house where I felt safe and loved. Through the window, I could see Sarah at her desk, working on scholarship applications. Michael was in his room, probably video chatting with friends or working on one of the computer programming projects Emma had assigned him. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Not perfect. Certainly, we all still grieved for the people David and Jessica might have been, the family we might have had. But real, honest, supportive, and built on love rather than manipulation. I opened my book, a mystery novel where the elderly protagonist outwits criminals half her age, and settled in for a peaceful evening. Tomorrow I had another speaking engagement, this time at a legal conference where attorneys would learn about recognizing signs of elder abuse in their clients. Next week, Emma and I were flying to Chicago, where I'd been invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee about the need for stronger federal protections for seniors. Next month, Sarah would graduate from high school as valedictorian, and we'd celebrate with a party in this same garden where my nightmare had begun and my new life had taken root. The future stretched ahead of me, full of possibilities I couldn't have imagined when I was drowning in grief and vulnerability. I had work to do, people to help, grandchildren to support, and a life to live on my own terms. David and Jessica had tried to erase me from everything that mattered. Instead, they had erased themselves and given me the motivation to become more visible, more vocal, and more determined than ever. I was 73 years old, and I was just getting started. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well. But sometimes, it's living well while making sure justice is served and other people are protected from the same harm you suffered. I was doing both, and Harold would have been proud. The garden would bloom again next spring. So would I, for as many springs as I had left. And that was exactly as it should be.